It struck me as I was listening to you that in a way, what you're describing is, the nemesis after hubris. We thought it was the end of history. We thought that we had, solved. There was no more boom and bust. That, things that had been done, for example, the European Union couldn't be undone, and that things were all in one direction. And that's been shown to not be true. Yeah. And now I think there's, again, at the sort of the broad level that you were talking, there's a choice to be made between, like many choices because there are many different policies. Do you double down, or do you admit that it was too ambitious? And when you admit that it was too ambitious, that kind of gives ammunition to your opponents, and indeed maybe lets go things that matter a lot, like the 0.7% of GDP. But if you double down, you're giving ammunition to your opponents because they can say that you were too ambitious, that you're continuing with your hubris, that you haven't listened, or whatever. Are there particular policies in which you see that you would like to discuss this playing out? For example, the 0.7% of GDP, which you were quite instrumental in.
So I don't regard doubling down as, in the way that you described it as a sort of stubborn, boneheaded insistence of just carrying on regardless and ignoring the great eruptions that are around us. I mean, you could argue that if only we had doubled down in the past, if only a lot of the ambitious claims made in Western liberal democracies had been fulfilled, then we wouldn't be in the position that we are in now. If governments, by the way, including mine, of which I was a Deputy Prime Minister, had done half the things we claimed we were going to do on housing, we wouldn't have this situation of near intergenerational theft, in which all the assets of British society are basically hoarded by the older generations to the cost of the younger generation. If not only the United Kingdom, but if other developed economies had moved to the 0.7% earlier and had pooled their efforts more effectively, then maybe we would have been able to do more earlier to reduce some of the demographic, socioeconomic and migratory pressures felt in poorer countries in the world. If regulators and politicians had done half the things they said they were going to in properly regulating the financial system, maybe 2008 would not have blown up in our face as we are. So I think it's terribly important when things go horribly wrong to obviously hold up a mirror and be very candid about where things have gone wrong, but not to do, which I think is a bit of the tendency at the moment, is to sort of try and chase the populists. You can see it in the argument about immigration. Mainstream politicians everywhere, including this country, they try and chase the populists. They try and chase the anti-immigrant brigade. They sort of say, well, if we kind of strike anti-immigration poses, not as unreasonably as Nigel Farage, but still send the same signal, somehow will satisfy that public discontent. Of course, you don't do anything. You don't.
Well, you legitimise the arguments.
So I'm afraid I'm not of the doubling down variety, but I am of the view that Western liberal democracy is not a perfect ideology. It is not a creed that is without its flaws. But by golly, it's an important, rational, reasoned, enlightened, progressive creed that I don't think we should simply throw overboard because it's now facing such a difficult time right now. I really worry actually that inverted commas liberals almost end up doing the populist job for them by kind of somehow conceding to them that they're right. I don't think Trump is right. Farage is not right. Can I just say a word about populism and then I will shut up because it's a very long answer to it, but it's very important. People talk about populism, but populism can be a positive thing. Mahatma Gandhi was a populist in one way. Populism in the purest dictionary definition is the rejection of elites by a public or a mass of people who don't feel that they're being properly listened to or attended to. That's fine. The problem with modern populism, and certainly the populisms you see in Europe and North America, is it's actually a very dark political art in which people like Farage, Le Pen, Viktor Orban, Geert Wilders, Trump and the rest, they're first very skilled at saying that they somehow feel people's anger more than anybody else. Then, of course, they claim that they uniquely have a sort of umbilical relationship with the folk, with the people, and they lump everybody together. The people have spoken. And then thirdly, they say, and your anger can be sated by blaming it on them. So Trump blames it on the Mexicans, and Farage et al. Blame it on Europe, and Viktor Orban blames it on Islam, and Le Pen blames it on immigration, and Geert Wilders blames it on everyone, and the Daily Mail blames it, no doubt, on me, and and so and that's what you have to reject that. You can't compromise with it. You have to reject that.
So on the specific thing that you mentioned, I completely agree with you on housing, by the way. I think it's the single thing. It's the one thing that...
Certainly here.
Yeah, in this country. You were in government and you didn't do it. So what was the obstacle? I mean, I presume there were many obstacles, but it's an example of how hard it can be to do what we all know is right.
So without turning this into a seminar about housing, the mistake we made, which was partly a policy mistake and partly an ideological mistake, I remember having lengthy arguments with particularly George Osborne about this, is that the coalition government, and indeed previous Labour and Conservative governments, so all parties are culpable of this, were relying on market incentives. They can be planning reforms, tax incentives, bungs, relaxation of red tape, exemption of it was constantly throwing a barrage of incentives at the private sector in the hope that the private sector developers would build at the scale needed. And actually what you're witnessing in the housing market is just a straightforward, vast market failure. The market will never build the number of houses, the 250, 300,000 houses which it is estimated are required simply to bring demand and supply into balance, because it has no incentive to do so, because it would flatten or even reduce average house prices, which then of course removes the market incentive to do so. So I just think, I mean, I don't know about you, I certainly find as I get older, so I pompously at the age of 50, but I sort of become a bit more, inverted commas, a bit more small c conservative in some respects, and a lot more kind of statist and left-wing in other respects. On housing, I've become radically statist. Yeah. It's just a classic example where you need aggressive state intervention. You need to mobilise the financial muscle of the state, and you need to overcome everything from local resistance to the financial bottlenecks in order to build house building process. So I won't bore you with it. We did actually try a number of sort of early trials of direct house building by the state during my time in office, for the first time in many, many, many years. I actually think that needs to be expanded.
So the reason I bring housing up specifically isn't just because I agree with you that it's central, it's because it's the only example I can think of something that can be positive sum. So everything else now has been set up internally in our politics, largely framed around Brexit, has been set up as, you win, I lose, and if I win, you must lose. So everything that we might do to move forward on Brexit is framed as, we give in to the EU or we defeat the EU. And nobody's going to be happy. So this is the only thing I can think of where we could actually do something that would add to the general well-being of Britons. No, some people will be losers, people who have houses and no children. Is there anything else you can identify that has that possibility to increase the cake on the table? And I'm not trying to use Boris Johnson's cake and eater thing. I just mean to sort of generally give us more to divide. Everything else seems to be so negative.
Gosh, that's a big question. Can I just say on the housing thing, you say it's not losers. I mean, this is rather tediously going over history. I tried to get the government, of which I was Deputy Prime Minister, to agree to a very, very radical building of, I think it was 10 garden cities in this sort of arc between Oxford and Cambridge where you live. Because there's no point building homes unless you build them in the places where actually people want to live and where there's work, where people want to raise families and so on. And it's obvious if you're going to do it on that scale, you can't do it in this hopelessly ad hoc way we do in Britain, where you fill in a few homes here. You've got to do it in a big, planned way. You've got to plan the amenities, you've got to plan the transport connections, and so on. But of course, every single one of those garden cities would, if you followed the kind of model of Milton Keynes, say, are in Conservative constituencies. So of course the Conservatives said, no, not on your Nelly. So there is a political constraint.
Yeah,
but anyway.
But generally speaking, it would add to the stock of the house, of the nation.
One other big area I can think of is vocational education, further education, and adult reskilling. There's a very pernicious belief, unspoken or otherwise, in this country that academic qualifications are the only good qualifications. In fact, most, not all, most of the more socially equitable and economically competitive economies in Europe tend to be accompanied by much greater equality between vocational and academic education, both at the school system and beyond school. And it's something which has held us back. This kind of slightly inverted snobbery has held us back hopelessly. And again, this is not new. People have been talking about this and cogitating about this forever, just like housing. I mean, every government spews stuff about vocational education revolution, and there are white papers and green papers and this, that, and the other. So the question is, which is the good one you pose, is why, if we kind of know that these are the things that grow the cake in a positive sum way rather than a zero-sum way, why don't we seem to crack it? I think it's partly because a lot of these things you can only make a difference over quite a long period of time, so they don't fit with the political cycle. Yes. That's certainly one of the reasons.
But they're the things that you have to be, as a politician, you have to be a salesman. You have to persuade people, that you're starting.
Yeah, and surely, and I'm sure there's some Christmas cracker Chinese saying that for every crisis there's a silver lining, or you know what I mean. There was one of but the silver lining.
When I lived in Brazil, what people used to say is, never let an opportunity, never let a crisis go to waste. Except in Argentina, where you never. In every crisis there's an opportunity, but in Argentina they make an opportunity out of every crisis. They never miss an opportunity.
But taking the first bit of that, not the Argentinian bit of it.
Yeah.
The one thing which I do think political leaders can do now, because I just think we have been so badly injured and so badly shaken by 2008 and subsequent years, is to appeal to a wider sense that there are short-term choices and sacrifices we need to make.
Yes.
I mean, dare I say it, look, I was part of a government, and some people criticise for it, anyway, I won't rehearse that, but I was part of a government that said, look, you can't ignore the damage to the money that a government receives and the money that the government to the deficit in the wake of the crisis. And we made a political virtue of saying to folk, look, you can't just ask the next generation to saddle the debts of this one. You have to kind of start doing a repair job to it. Then there's a whole great debate about whether we did it too much or too little, or was it...
But you managed to make an argument.
But you made a big argument.
Yes.
That's my point. My point is it was a big argument about a big thing which actually involves unpleasant and difficult choices. So it can be done. It can be done. I mean, that is where the art, it's not a science, that's where the art of political leadership lies. And the problem at the moment, there is no political leadership, because it's all the oxygen of politics is just being sucked out of British politics completely by this sort of vortex of Brexit.
Yeah, I've read the argument. I don't find it convincing, but I wonder, do you see anything in it that, we've tossed everything up in the air now, and in a way it was all so broken that there might be some benefit to having done that?
Well, here's one of the reasons why I think that is it's a kind of thing that commentators can say without actually having to do it. Political capital, like all forms of capital, is finite. There are only so many hours in the day. There's only so much energy. There are only so many arguments you can take on. There are only so many photo-finish votes that you can countenance in Parliament. There's only so much you can ask of civil servants. The system can only do so much at one time. It isn't an infinitely elastic thing. That's why almost always the best political leaders are those who are ruthless about deciding, here are the 2 or 3 things I want to do, and I'm absolutely going to hammer away at that to the exclusion of everything else. And the problem is the whole system is now completely paralysed. This Brexit thing was supposed to be a bolt for freedom, and exactly, it was supposed to emancipate us to take back control and do exactly whatever we like. In fact, it's crippling the system of government, both in parliamentary terms and also in terms of Whitehall. Are
there any opportunities that you see? I mean, there are countries outside Europe. It is our neighbourhood, but it is also a sort of a fixed, ageing place. Are there opportunities? Are there places that we could do more as Britain than as part of the EU? You could possibly do a little bit more, a little bit more trade with the Americans, a little bit more trade with the Chinese. But the idea that you could do that in a way which is as a surrogate or can replace the lost trade as we tear up our membership of, remember, Margaret Thatcher's single market, is an illusion. I may have got this right. I need to double check it. I think if you double the trade that presently exists between the United Kingdom and what's loosely called the Anglosphere, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, the United States, who have I missed? I think it's about it. If you just double the trade with
which is the great sort of sentimental hankering of Liam Fox and others, the English-speaking world, you still wouldn't match the amount of trade we presently have with our nearest neighbours. There's a very good reason for that. See, one of the things that, and I'm sorry, I'm going to start ranting here, but one of the things that the Brexiteers have done, and which is so intellectually dishonest, they're pretending to people that geography doesn't matter. Despite all the innovations of technology and all the extraordinary sort of push-button realities of globalisation where money can be transferred from one part of the globe to the other, good old-fashioned geography, who are your neighbours, remains the biggest single determinant for trade flows in the world. There's a reason why we trade more with Little Island than we do with some of the great economic superpowers in Asia. There's a reason why Mexico and Canada trade, and will always trade more with America than we do, because they're right next door to each other. And the problem is these Brexiteers think you can stop geography. You can't stop. We are tectonically, geologically condemned to be in Europe. And the fact that they think otherwise, it really distresses me, because there's just no evidence for it. In fact, all the evidence, I think I'm right in saying that there's been some quite authoritative academic work which suggests that, roughly speaking, for every mile of distance that you double between two economies, you, roughly speaking, halve the amount of trade between them. And that's the problem. There isn't this sort of panacea on the other side of the world, and all we need. And also, by the way, just technically, and I say this as a bit of a sort of trade dweeb, having worked as a sort of minor.
You weren't asked. Would you come back to Dex? You weren't asked to come back to DexEU and help out.
No, I wasn't. No, Liam Fox is not asked. No. But the point I was going to make, when I worked in the EU many years ago, I worked as a small cog in the wider kind of machine negotiating EU trade agreements. The thing you have to remember is, if you're India or Brazil or China or whatever, your trade relationship with the United Kingdom is entirely driven by what they think your relationship is with these huge European markets.
Sure.
So from their point of view, they're not going to. I mean, I make a safe prediction that the British government now will be making desperate covert attempts to come up with some kind of threadbare trade deal with the Americans, which they hope to be able to unveil in some press release and some meeting and some photo opportunity the day after Brexit has finally come to a reality. It probably will have almost nothing in it. Maybe a few little tariffs you can reduce, maybe a little bit of extra stuff you can do on equivalents in services and so on. But it actually won't, it really can't, just for various technical reasons, it can't just reinvent trade completely. And then, of course, the Daily Mail will say, this is an absolute, this shows that our cousins, our English-speaking cousins on the other side of the Atlantic have shown who our true friends are, rather than these ghastly foreigners on the other side of the Channel. But it'll be all smoke and mirrors. It'll be some symbolic trade agreement. And no one should imagine that will be sufficient to compensate or to outweigh the very, very great losses that we are likely to incur if we carry on the present trajectory, which is not just to leave the EU, but also to leave the customs union and the single market.
So the book title,
yes.
How to Stop Brexit, I presume you have a sort of an elevator pitch version of how to stop Brexit.
Yes.
Do you want to tell us?
Thank you for asking.
You wondered if I ever
yes.
would, I presume.
No. It's very simple. I just think we need to pressure, cajole, and urge my erstwhile colleagues in Parliament to do their job. Next year, they will be presented by Theresa May and David Davis with whatever threadbare deal they've been able to cobble together with Michel Barnier and the other EU 27 countries. And all I'm advocating in my book is, at that point, MPs should do their democratic duty, which is to compare the promises made to their constituents by the Brexiteers, 350 million quid a week for the NHS, a VAT cut, smaller class sizes, a panacea of new trade deals, etc., etc. They need to compare that with what their constituents are actually getting in the deal. And I make a safe prediction that not only many of those commitments won't be met, I don't think any of them will be met. None of them. At that point, surely it is just a matter of democratic principle that if the government of the day has failed to deliver any of the commitments that have been, and any of the legitimate expectations that have been raised at the time of the referendum, then MPs should say, it's not a question of a choice, should say, I'm sorry, we're going to withhold our consent for that. Now that would then of course trigger a period of turbulence, political turbulence no doubt, and so on and so forth. But I can't see any way in which we can back out of the cul-de-sac we are in, which doesn't start with MPs basically saying, up with this, we will not put. So I think good old-fashioned pressure on MPs over the next year is really, really essential.
I always try to ask speakers at conferences and so on if they can suggest one thing that they'd like the audience to do. So you've actually done that without me asking. That's something you want everyone here to do. I'm going to open this to questions. People can ask questions online as well, people who are watching online, but also people here if you prefer to do it that way. But I'm happy to have hands up. Is there a roving mic or? Yes, there is. Do you want to take this gentleman here?
I'm Simon Maxwell. I used to work here, and I also chair the European Think Tanks Group. And I'm on your side, except I think I have a quicker way to get to avoiding Brexit than you, but we'll come back to that maybe later. This is a development institute. One of the things we say in Development Institute is that the agenda's changing with much more emphasis on global problems and global collective goods. Climate change, conflict, drugs, terror, of course, migration. But what we also say is that ministers make choices at the margins between whether to do something through the UN or the EU or the Council of Europe or the Commonwealth. And the question that we always struggle with in our European conversation is, what's the comparative of Europe on these big issues, and what should Europe not try to do on these big issues and leave to others?
Gosh.
What's the comparative advantage?
I mean, why Europe and not the UN? Or why
so
Europe and
what's
not the Commonwealth on climate change and globalization and all the other things you talked about at the beginning?
I find that very difficult to answer. You'll be able to answer it better than I do. I guess it's partly to do with efficacy. Where is the European Union proving to be effective compared to others? If other agglomerations are much more effective than the European Union, then we shouldn't allow European amour propre to sort of stand in the way of either supporting those efforts or joining in with them. But clearly the European Union has sort of both scale and clout and money and teeth in a way that, for instance, the Commonwealth does not. I mean, it's just a much, much richer, more sophisticated, more muscular form of governance. It is able to marshal money and deploy political will in a way that the Commonwealth certainly can't. As far as the UN and the UN agencies are concerned, I'll sort of defer to you. My memory of this is that there are some issues where everybody recognises the UN is taking a particular lead. And in a sense, the EU is just like the US; it's just providing checks, and in other areas that's not the case. By the way, this is slightly adjacent to your question, but hopefully related to it. I think my worry, amongst many others, is that as the United Kingdom pulls out of the European Union, which is that, assuming, as I think we should, certainly, for the foreseeable future, we retain the 0.7% commitment. The temptation for British governments is going to be just to use that 0.7% commitment in an ever more incoherent way. I mean, the one thing about the EU, it's frustrating, it's slow, it's a convoy of 28 countries, you have to find consensus, there are internal rivalries, there's the European Commission, there's the tug of war between one institution and the next and so on. But it tries to organise itself in a coherent way. In other words, that development aid is spent in a way that is consistent with its wider strategic, economic and political priorities. I worked for 2 years from 1994 to 1996. Just to give you a little example, I managed EU technical assistance projects in Central Asia and the Caucasus in pursuit or aligned to the then, I'm assuming it still exists now, the then strategic EU objective of opening a sort of trade passageway across the Caspian Sea, around the Black Sea, but from Central Asia to Europe. And of course, the problem is the UK will be so desperate to try and sort of find friends, develop new bilateral relationships, enter new trade agreements, that the 0.7 pot will just be used as a sort of as a sort of like a bowl of sweets to kind of hand out randomly to whichever passing ally or friend we think, could do with a bit of extra love. And that really, that worries me, because it means that the coherence by which development aid is spent, either through the EU or through these other multilateral organisations, is lost altogether.
So you're not worried about it actually, not very worried about it actually being ended, the commitment?
Oh yeah, sure. No. I mean, look, there's
a campaign to try and stop it.
Sorry?
There's a campaign to try and end it.
Oh yeah. No, listen. I mean, I know you'll be aware of this here, but do not, under any circumstances, be under any illusions about how unpopular this is. I mean, I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say the thousands of radio phone-ins I've done over the last decade or more, the thousands of doors I've knocked on in southwest Sheffield and elsewhere. I would put this up very close to the kind of top 3 of the most unpopular things that the public throw at politicians like me, for very good reasons. Well, you know the argument. It's such an emotionally resonant argument. My care home's being closed. My child's having cuts to the local primary school. The NHS is losing beds. The bus fare's just gone up. And you want to spend the money instead on the other side of the planet. What on earth are you doing? Charity starts at home. I mean,
what do you say to people who say this?
Well, you make the argument that institutes like the ODI, it's your bread and butter. You make the argument that it's not only morally or ethically the right thing to do to try and seek to help those who are less fortunate than ourselves, but there's enlightened self-interest in doing so as well. But it's a very, very tough argument to make, because it doesn't. That's a highfalutin argument compared to, hang on a minute, they haven't even been able to fill in the pothole down at the end of my road because the council says it doesn't have enough money. Mm-hmm. So, do not underestimate. I remember when in coalition, I'm sure some of you remember this, it was a commitment of both coalition parties to enshrine the 0.7% commitment in law. And we included it in the coalition agreement. And then in 2013, David Cameron suddenly insisted that it should be scrapped from the Queen's speech, because the Mail and the Express and the backbenchers were going loopy about it. And then we used Mike Moore's private members bill as a way of forcing the Conservatives. So I literally just had to embarrass David Cameron. So we now have this vote in the House of Commons because Mike Moore, a Liberal Democrat MP, has chosen this as his bill, his private members bill. You cannot, you have to vote for this because it's in line with your manifesto, the coalition agreement, and so on. In other words, we had to use every trick in the book to just get them to do what they had in their manifesto and the coalition agreement agreed to do. So, do not. Yeah. It is very. I don't know what the polling shows. I suspect the polling shows it's very unpopular.
Well, it is cited as a reason for Brexit because people conflate the 0.7% of GDP with the famous 350 million a week. So sort of circling back to the first thing I asked you, it strikes me as possibly a slight, devil's argument here is it was overambitious. If it's that unpopular in a democracy, it's part of what makes people think that the elite aren't listening. You can make a good argument, yes, but you're having to make an argument. They're saying to you, I want more spent on my schools, and you're saying, but there's this fancy argument. Were you too ambitious?
No, well, I don't have an easy answer to that, because there is no doubt, candidly, that sometimes to do what is right isn't always consistent with what is popular.
Yeah, and this is a democracy,
but that's why that is what politics and leadership is about. Leadership is not about followership, in my view. You can't just simply, just chase whatever is the latest mood. You have to try and be guided by certain lodestars. But you're right. The art of politics is to make sure that you are leading as well as following, but that you understand when you need to kind of trim or when you need to follow. No, and I'll give you another good example. We introduced in the coalition government something which I judged at the time was absolutely the right thing to do, and for which there was a great public demand, and that was to enshrine something which was called the triple lock guarantee on the increase of the state pension. And I won't bore you with the details, but you'll remember Margaret Thatcher had broken the earnings link, so the value of the state pension had declined for years and years and years and years and years and years. And pensioner poverty had exploded and so on. And so we said, Steve Webb, a colleague of mine, came up with the idea that we would enshrine in the rules an increase such that the state pension would go up by 2.5% inflation or earnings, or whichever was highest. Mm-hmm. Now, that kind of makes sense, particularly if you're living in a world of normal inflation or relatively high inflation.
And normal earnings increase
and
as
normal
well.
Increase.
Yeah.
It makes absolutely no sense over time, particularly when you've closed the gap with other benefits received by other generations through the welfare system. So I think the triple lock should be, if not ended, and it certainly should be amended now. Maybe it shouldn't be 2.5%. Mm-hmm. Maybe it should be a double lock rather than a triple lock. And there are all sorts of variants you can do to make sure it's both affordable, but also that it's not intergenerationally as unfair as it now risks becoming. That's a classic example of something which was actually the right thing to do at the time.
I think it probably wasn't, because it was the sort of thing that you could never reverse.
Well, maybe. Okay. Yeah. Well, you're being too rational. That's the problem. You're being too rational.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's just another.
Popular, yeah.
It's another example of we're doing something that is right and popular can eventually become still very popular because, of course, it's popular amongst older voters, but not as right as it once was.
Do I have any other questions in the room? I do. This lady here, yeah, just behind you with the mic. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much, Nick, for your comments. I'm Malina Rocha-Menocal from the Overseas Development Institute in the Politics and Governance program. This conversation has made me think of this cartoon. I don't know if you have seen it in the New Yorker about passengers in the plane saying that they feel that the pilot is not listening to them, that they're being alienated from the process of flying the plane and what they should do about it. And I think it's really important to keep in mind that there is a difference between representative democracy and plebiscitarian democracy, and the UK is meant to be the former rather than the latter. But to the point you were making earlier about what we can do to exert pressure and keep the debate going, I'm wondering how MPs read the results of the elections in June, because really it was a slap in the face to what we thought was going to happen, all of us collectively, and perhaps really sent as strong a signal as we could have had about the fact that people were not entirely satisfied with the route that politics was taking and the direction that Brexit in particular was taking, and yet it seems again that MPs are not listening. So what is it that will make them listen if it's not an electoral result like the one we had before, and what can we do going forward?
So the problem with your particular interpretation of the election result, and of course the Brexiteers have been very quick to point this out, was that the very dramatic increase in the vote for Jeremy Corbyn, people in their hearts might have thought they were voting against Brexit, but of course the Brexiteers have said, look at the Labour Party manifesto. It's committed to Brexit. Jeremy Corbyn has voted against every act of European integration in the 30 years he's been in Parliament. He's a well-renowned Eurosceptic. So it merely confirms, I'm just being, this is the way that your interpretation is turned on its head. And it is complex because, there is a lot of evidence that a lot of people voted particularly for the Labour Party because they were unhappy with the direction of Brexit under the Conservatives. But it is equally incontrovertible that in Jeremy Corbyn they have a leader who, just look at his history, he's voted against Maastricht, against Amsterdam, against Lisbon, against our entry in the European community in the first place. He's a classic 1970s left-wing Eurosceptic. So we, in a sense, you're seeking to make a distinction between what the leadership of the Labour Party said, and indeed what its manifesto said, and the motives of people. But the problem is, making claims and counterclaims about the motives of people is quite a perilous thing to do. You ask what more can be done. A lot more can be done now. You'll have to buy my book and read it.
It's for sale outside afterwards.
And it would make an excellent Christmas gift for all your neighbours and friends as well. But having been on the receiving end of sort of representations, particularly at constituency level, as a constituency MP for over a decade here, it might sound quaint and old-fashioned, and in many ways it is quaint and old-fashioned, but just good old-fashioned face-to-face pressure on MPs in their constituencies and in their constituency surgeries is one of the most important tried and trusted ways of applying pressure to MPs in British. MPs will respond not to mass postcard campaigns or emails from people elsewhere whining about this, that, and the other. MPs respond if they think that opinion is shifting in their own neck of the woods, in their own constituencies. So what I in effect advocate in my book is mass infiltration of the Labour and the Conservative parties by Remain voters. It's happened before. What?
I joined the Lib Dems.
No.
Yeah.
Please don't stop that. But my point to you is just an arithmetical one. I'd love to think that the Liberal Democrats are going to run Parliament this time next year. They're not. If you really want to change the political weather, somehow we have to persuade scores of Labour and Conservative MPs who privately think Brexit is a very bad idea, who themselves have voted for Remain, but for some reason don't think they have the permission or the latitude from their own constituents to do what they know is right. And so I'm just being very pragmatic. You have to give them the permission, the courage of their convictions to do what is right next year. And a year is a long time in politics. I'm completely convinced it can be done.
I'm going to take two questions now together. I think there's a gentleman who's had his hand up here for a while and this lady here in the third row as well. It wasn't you, I'm afraid. It was just Yeah. And if there's another mic, it can come to this lady here, and then we'll just take both questions, and then Nick can... Yeah.
Andrew Ross from Global Garden. You started your remarks laying the blame squarely on the financial market crash as being the fundamental of the disputatious politics we're in now. However, the success of the climate change conference in Paris was arguably due to the world's financial market, the $100 trillion global bond market, and the insurers of the world committing to invest at least $1 trillion a year in green bonds to enable sustainable economic development. They simply can't find the projects that are at scale with creditworthy issuers, with a little bit of ROI, but they don't return on investment, but they don't really care about that. It's a massive opportunity to actually make friends with the money market and use these tidal forces to generate the politics. Which politician's going to grab hold of this money?
So hold that thought, and can we pass the microphone forward, and I'll take another question here. Yeah, this lady here in the third row. Just put your hand up and show them where you are. Yeah.
My name is Ali Matudi Monikeni, and I'm an anti-FGM campaigner. Talk of the Coalition Party, and Nick and Baroness Lynn Featherstone were instrumental in getting a lot of work around end FGM in my country, Sierra Leone, for example. And we saw the importance of aid from Britain going into the Ebola crisis in Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea. So for us as sort of the receiving end of aid, it has changed many lives and has made lives for women and girls in countries where I'm from sort of livable. So my question is, in terms of Brexit and what that would mean for inequality and justice, social justice around the world, where do you see that?
So I've left you with two rather big questions to answer, I'm afraid. Sometimes things work out this way when you take a couple of questions together.
So on the first, there has actually been in this country a huge increase in. I know it's not. I'll broaden it out to the wider global issue, but there has been a huge influx and increase in investment in green and renewable energy particularly over the last 7 years, and in part, I would like to suggest that was in part because of some very important policy and regulatory changes that we introduced at government level, the creation of the world's first green investment bank, stupidly now sold off by this government, the electricity market reform, which changed the financial incentives for investment in renewable energies. All this complex contracts for difference, change in the tariff structure and so on. And there's been, I think, the biggest increase now in investment in renewable energies in this country, certainly, I think, in a generation or so. Your question you asked is which politician is going to grab hold of this? It's a bit like the 0.7%. People in a room like this intuitively think it's the right thing to do. But to persuade the public that it's a popular thing to do is a lot more difficult than your question implies. Because one of the ways in which investment in green and renewable energies is incentivized is that you give, you say they don't want a ROI, a return on investment. My experience is they do. And they certainly need some kind of predictability about the kind of pricing in the energy market going forward. So what then happens is regulators and governments intervene to say, in effect, to simplify a lot of technocratic stuff, you guarantee a price going forward. But what happens then is, as has happened recently, the oil price goes down, and everyone says, this is ridiculous. Why are you giving a guaranteed energy price to these investors when oil price has just gone down? You're keeping prices artificially inflated. And what you will find if you read the Express, the Telegraph, the Mail, the Sun and so on, the thing after the 0.7% that is probably the most popular campaign these days is to stop so-called green crap, because they claim that that is the reason why energy prices, the money you pay every week and every month on your electricity and gas prices, are artificially high. Now, I think you and I would agree that there's a very, very good countervailing argument against that, which is if you have stability of prices over a long period of time, actually over time, by flattening out the wild gyrations of hydrocarbon fuel prices, you actually save people a lot of money. But it's a really difficult sell politically to say that somehow maybe prices are marginally higher now than they would be if you followed the downward gyrations of current gas and oil prices. It's a rather lengthy reply. It's merely just simply to indicate that it's not quite as straightforward in the rather crude tug of war of politics to make the case for those pretty aggressive interventions in the energy market, which make those very significant investments possible. But it needs to be done, and again, it's a bit like the 0.7%, it needs to be done by people explaining the issue and exercising some leadership. I'm very glad that you mentioned Lynn Featherstone, because you're quite right. I think Lynn Featherstone, which is not only a dear friend of mine, but I think she did an amazing job when she was a development minister in government. And one of the things she did both there, but prior to that in the Home Office, champion was some real groundbreaking measures against FGM. And good luck to you in all your ongoing work on that. I don't have an easy answer to you about the link between Brexit and inequality elsewhere, other than to say that I think, as I said earlier, I think there will be a capriciousness and a volatility and a lack of predictability and a lack of coherence creeping into the way in which the UK spends its development money in future if we proceed with this Brexit. Because obviously I may be wrong, I don't think I am, but there you go. I think Brexit is pointing the United Kingdom to a somewhat friendless future. I think being unanchored from your own hemisphere is not a smart thing to be in the kind of globalised 21st century. And so I think as a country we'll do a lot of sort of rather random ducking and weaving to try and make sense of the world in which we're suddenly a much more isolated component. And I think inevitably our foreign aid budget will be used to kind of find new friends, consolidate new trade relationships. In other words, the coherence with which aid has been used in the past for some of the purposes that you mentioned, I think will give way to short-term geopolitics.
Nick, I have some very, very good news for you. Hashtag ODI Clegg is now trending on the UK on Twitter. Right. So that's good. So you can go home and you can tell your wife that you actually succeeded.
You check whether hers trended when she was here, yeah.
Yeah, possibly not. We can pretend it didn't anyway. So 2 questions that have come in from here. The first one, very nice question. Given the state that we're in, how can you engage and encourage bright young things to go into politics and policy? So some thoughts on that. And then the other one is a follow-on, actually, from the questions and the comments on the 0.7% of overseas development aid. Doesn't the SDGs agenda help to drive that, help to keep it coherent, and the 2030 agenda, because that's a co-responsibility agenda? Yeah. So anyway, how do we get people to go into politics if they, have better things to be thinking about than tearing up 45 years plus of relationships?
I think it cuts both ways. I think the spectacle of politics at the moment, the kind of what appears to be sort of catastrophic loss of strategic leadership in certainly in British politics, not to mention the appalling sight of these sexual scandals now coming to light in Westminster. I mean, on the one hand, that must be deeply off-putting to any young, idealistic, motivated person. But on the other hand, I suspect it'll also anger people so much and motivate people. So, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if the Brexit vote becomes a sort of defining, galvanizing moment for many younger people, just as the Iraq War was for a previous generation or other sort of seminal moments. And I hope amongst that there'll be some folk who will feel that they want to, they feel they're not being spoken for by the current generation of politicians and want to do something about it. I mean, when I'm asked by someone who says, I want to go into politics, I do generally advise that it's best for folk to first do something else with their lives before going to politics. I think one of the things that's gone wrong in politics is that there are too many people in it who are exclusively dependent on politics for their own material well-being, their own sense of self-respect, their own identity, and so on. Often the best politicians are politicians who actually, at the end of the day, could leave it. The very unhealthy thing is when people are just so dependent on politics for their own sense of kind of identity almost, that it just becomes something which they feel they can't live without. Usually the best politicians are those who are actually prepared to say, do you know what, if push comes to shove, I could do without this and I'm prepared. Because you have to take, particularly in difficult circumstances, I think you have to take quite big risks with your own reputation in politics sometimes to do the right thing. So that would be my advice on that. And on the other, what was it? Oh, no, sorry, yes, I should have mentioned that in response to the earlier question, not least because I represented Britain at one of the formative summits on the decision on the SDGs themselves. You're quite right, the SDGs do serve as a very important tram line and perhaps even straitjacket, preventing the United Kingdom from flying off in every direction, and it's one of the many reasons why we should be very, very supportive of them. So no, that's a good counterbalance, a good constraint on unilateralism, I guess. Yeah.
Well, 2 very good questions there. Have I some more in the room? This lady here.
Hi, Marta from the I was taken by your reflections on how unpopular both aid and climate issues are to sell to the public. So let me ask you about migration, because you mentioned it as an area where we should not be following the populace. So how would you go about it, assuming that part of it is also to make a positive, realistic case for a sustainable solution in something which I can't think of anything that is likely to be less popular in the UK, and possibly in Europe, if you have some ideas?
So I think there are a number of aspects to this. I mean, the first thing to say is that not always, and I'll come to the caveat in a minute, but quite often people who say that they are most motivated by immigration or they're uneasy about immigration live in communities which are not always, but very often entirely unaffected by immigration. I mean, I'll give you a little anecdote. And by the way, this is not to say they're wrong, because perception in a sense is everything. And so you have to deal with people's fears, but all I'm saying is that those fears are sometimes not supported by lived experience. I remember, I'll never forget, as long as I live, many years ago, well before I became an MP, I think even before I was a Euro MP, I was helping out in a local by-election in Chesterfield in southern Derbyshire. And I remember I had my rosette, fluttering in the spring wind, and I went up to this chap who lived in a very neat bungalow, and he'd just finished mowing his lawn in front of his bungalow, and he was leaning, it sounds apocryphal, but it's true, he was leaning very proudly on his front sort of fence. And I went up to him, and this was at the time, I'm not sure if any of you remember this, it was at the time when there was a great deal of controversy. It was daily slapped on the front page of the tabloids. It was the time, early on in Tony Blair's time in office, when there was huge controversy about the dispersal of asylum seekers from the Kent ports to various parts of the country. And the Home Office, in true Home Office fashion, made a difficult situation spectacularly worse by contracting with some cowboy property owners in some of the most deprived communities in the country and just plonked these poor asylum seekers, dislocated them from their family, just plonked them in some of the most deprived communities in the country, who unsurprisingly reacted very badly to this. Anyway, I remember going up to this chap and saying, hello, will you support the Lib Dems? And he went, no, I'm not going to. I said, oh, why not? Oh, because of all these asylum seekers. Now, at the time, I knew that there wasn't a single asylum seeker that had been dispersed at that time from the Kent ports to that part of Derbyshire. So I remember saying to him, I said, oh, right, well, I'm sorry to hear that. I'd just be interested to know, have you met some of these asylum seekers, maybe seen them in the supermarket or the GP surgery or the post office? And then he said something which has lived with me ever since. He said, no, I haven't seen any of them, but I know they're everywhere. And I don't mean that to denigrate him. I just mean that politically it's really, really tricky, this, because you're dealing with very visceral fears which aren't necessarily, don't necessarily, the European referendum is a classic example. The areas such as London, which has the highest levels of immigration, I think now the London population, 36% of the local population is foreign born, had whatever it was, over 60% voting for Remain. If you go to Redcar I think had 65% voting or more for Brexit, and in local opinion polls people cited immigration as one of the major issues, and yet I think of the local population, those who are foreign or born elsewhere are 2%. Now there are some exceptions. If you go to some rural fruit and vegetable picking parts of Lincolnshire and Eastern England, there are some communities which have changed out of all recognition very, very quickly, principally but not exclusively because of Baltic labour immigration into those parts of the economy. But, sorry, it's a very roundabout way of saying is that so you have to tackle this in a way which tries to unpack the difference between people's fears and I think actually confront people sometimes, as per that conversation with that voter. I'm not, by the way, saying I've remotely converted him, because actually quite a lot of people will say they worry about immigration in general, but say that they're very content with the way things are running in their local community. And I think that's an area where politicians can act more imaginatively and with greater leadership locally, rather than simply fostering that kind of cycle of fear without challenging it with local facts. That's the first thing to say. Secondly, it is a totally legitimate expectation in a mature democracy that the government of the day has some sovereignty, some control, to use that overworn phrase, over its borders. As I said earlier, there's a debate about whether it's your own borders or whether it's shared borders with other countries. But you cannot expect in a mature democracy that you just say, well, we have no idea who's coming in and who's coming out. We don't know and we don't care. That's nonsense. Of course, you can't expect people to endorse that, and they shouldn't endorse that. So the second rather mundane observation is you just have to be competent in how you administer borders, how you administer people coming in and out of a space or coming in and out of a continent, coming in and out of a country. It is impossible to exaggerate how much damage it does to public confidence in the competence of their governments when they saw that terrible spectacle on their television screens every night in 2015 for month after month and after month of streams of poor people perishing in the Mediterranean, coming into Europe, and Europe reacting with a sort of beggar thy neighbour, no, it's their fault, barbed wires going up, fences going up, trains being stopped, refugee camps springing up. I mean, it was an unforgivably incompetent way of dealing with something that people have a legitimate expectation. And in Britain, it is just ridiculous that in Britain, we basically have no idea how many people are living here in effect illegally, in a legal vacuum, because they've overstayed their visa. And the reason why we don't know is because previous governments scrapped something called exit checks, so that you, of course, you show your passport with your visa when you come into the country, but the requirement to show your passport and show your visa was scrapped. It's now being reintroduced. So just basic competence. I mean, it really, and of course, as you know, famously in this country, the predictions made back in 2004 about the number of folk who would come to this country from Central and Eastern Europe when Tony Blair's government liberalised the British labour market when other major European economies did not, that did huge damage to public confidence. So, there's no way around it. You just need to show a certain level of competence. And then third and finally, I just think we just need to be much, much more self-confident in arguing about how immigration enriches our country in all senses of the word, obviously culturally, but also literally. I mean, we are clearly going to now suffer as a country economically. Our NHS is going to suffer. Our public services are going to suffer. So the argument can be made. But the problem at the moment is it's not being made at all. And it's this combination of generalised fear, mismanagement and incompetence, with a failure of both politicians, the business community and people in public services of simply making the case for it. I think it can be done.
I think your story of your non-Lib Dem voter who makes it clear he's really, really never going to vote for you no matter what you say, and still you have to engage him, reminds us all that as a politician you have developed, if you didn't have it already, a sort of bulletproof skin. And you must have a way of getting up in the morning and keeping going when things are falling apart about you, as the book title suggests, with the sort of Make Britain Great Again. How do you stay cheerful? Where do you find the opportunities and the sources of hope in this absolute mess that we're seeing around us at the moment? Tell me some things to be cheerful about. Help me, please.
Well, God, this is such a naff thing to say, and I famously blotted my copybook with younger voters over university fees. But notwithstanding that, I'm really, really optimistic about what younger people want. They don't want this future. They didn't vote for this future. Over 70% of 18 to 24-year-old voters said they want something else, and that gives me great optimism. Great optimism.
They're not going to get what they wanted.
Well, I don't think you can keep a whole generation down. I don't think you can, in a mature democracy, just airbrush out of the equation the hopes and the dreams and aspirations of millions of voters who have the future in their hands. Eventually that will come out.
Okay,
eventually Paul Dacre won't be editor of the Daily Mail. These awful, awful things do pass. If younger voters espoused angry, illiberal, aggressive views en masse, then I would get pretty down. I've got young, my children are smaller, they're 15, 13, 8. But even my two teenagers, I'm just sort of massively uplifted by by how they and their friends kind of talk about the world. And I think they're far, far more sophisticated and uplifting in their view of the world than I was as a snotty-nosed teenager. So no, I'm optimistic in that way. And I do think, actually, in many respects, what you're seeing, particularly in the Brexit vote, is a sort of sting in the tail for an old order that is actually on its way out anyway. So sorry, and I'm now going to be accused. I'm not being ageist. I'm not saying older voters are all ghastly. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that the future is shaped by those who will inhabit it, and just that's life. It'll be inhabited by the young, and the young, it seems to me, have, on the whole, a really, really good set of values. They've got a lot of problems, a lot of anxieties, but they've got a really good set of values. So that makes me optimistic. And also, I just, having said I'm not seeking to cast aspersions on older voters, which I'm not, I do cast aspersions, and I'm very critical of what is basically now a cabal of old men who, it seems to me, basically run this country. You've got Paul Dacre, this ghastly man who runs the Daily Mail, I've told you before, Rupert Murdoch, the Barclay brothers, and a bunch of older, almost all exclusively male donors who for years and years and years have been shoveling vast amounts of money into the hands of UKIP and the Conservative Party and anti-European think tanks and pressure groups and so on. People like Aaron Banks, who are now quite rightly being investigated by the Electoral Commission for doing so, it is alleged, I should say, in a dodgy way. Who are these old men? How dare they think that they can make us all dance to their tune? Many of them don't even live in this country or pay taxes in this country. It infuriates me that they think arrogantly that they can just mess everything else up and just walk away as if it's of no consequence. So I kind of think, as long as people are brave and will say stuff as it is, and as long as the young voters who flocked, to my mind a little eccentrically, but nonetheless did flock to Lord Jeremy Corbyn in Glastonbury, as long as they keep their passion, and as long as they keep their voice, it's a really, really important thing that young voters did turn out. I wish they'd voted for the Lib Dems, but the much more important thing in the sweep of history is that they found their voice. They didn't stay at home, and if that remains the case, then I'm very optimistic, because they'll win through. Of course, they'll win through. They have to.
You've actually made me feel a lot better. I think you've already made everyone in the audience feel a lot better. I don't want to take another question because that was such a great place to stop. I just want to say thank you very, very much for a very broad-ranging conversation and actually an uplifting finish to it as well. So we'll all thank Nick, but also there's a reception afterwards and you can buy that book. Thank you very, very much.